Lucy Woodham is a lifelong dancer with a decade of experience working as a physiotherapist in sports and complex rehab. Over the years, Lucy has become increasingly interested in the link between physical experiences and psychological well-being, which has led her into a master's in psychology. Lucy has a passion for investigating culturally relevant and adaptable means to improving quality of life. Welcome, Lucy.
Hi.
Hi. Do you want to start us off, Lucy, telling us what brought you into salsa, into dance in the first place?
Yeah, so I started dancing when I was two.
Oh,
So
wow.
I'm actually a little bit deaf and I used to fall over a lot. And my mum was like, something's wrong with my child. She can't balance properly. So she took me into the doctor and they were like, yeah, she's got some balance issues and it's related to sort of the hearing side of things. She'll really benefit from dancing. So my mum put me into dancing when I was really young and I just kind of fell in love with it. Like I did jazz and tap and all sorts of other styles, theatre, performances, all throughout high school. And eventually went through right up until my teaching levels in jazz and tap. And then I actually injured my back quite badly when I was about 18. And at that point, I was deciding whether I wanted to pursue dancing or go into like an academic degree, something in health. And I decided because I had an injury, I wanted a career that it wouldn't be interrupted by that. So I ended up doing physiotherapy, but I really missed dancing. So I kind of was in a university town. It was a lot bigger. There was a lot more different dance styles available, and I ended up going to a salsa school and just really fell in love with it and started performing and competing with them. And it ended up becoming much more than just kind of a little something to do during the week. So yeah, I started getting really involved in it. Ended up working in the Caribbean with physiotherapy and did some dancing and stuff over there, and then ended up coming back and going over to Australia and training over there and doing some teaching over there. And then now I currently teach salsa for beginners and improvers, and I also teach ladies heels as well.
Fantastic. What a journey.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a wild ride.
What are the influences that you see from your research that dancing can have on the brain?
So there's actually some really, really interesting research on dancing.
Cool.
So dancing is known to increase what we call neuroplasticity in the brain. So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to kind of rewire itself in response to learning new tasks or adapting to new environments and these kind of things. And there's quite a few studies that look at neuroplasticity in brains of dancers, either compared to amateur dancers versus expert dancers or compared to dancers versus non-dancers. And we see that neuroplasticity is quite significantly increased in people who dance, which is really cool because then you can think, okay, well, it's they're more adaptable to their environments. They have better coping strategies because they can change their behaviors and opinions and stuff quite quickly, is what the research sort of tends to be showing, which is really interesting. There's also quite a bit of research looking at how dancers sort of look inwardly, so the interception, and how their body awareness is really, they're very skilled at body awareness. So they
Mhm.
have a very good understanding of what's happening internally. And that's shown to be really important when we make decisions and do other things as well. So
Mm.
yeah, there's a huge amount of research in dancing in terms of how it impacts our psychological and physical health, but also like at a neuroscience kind of level, there's a lot of research supporting activation of different pathways in the brain that are not necessarily related to movement. When an expert dancer watches someone dancing, we get activation of these things called mirror neurons, which are motor neurons in the brain that mirror the movement patterns that they're seeing. So it kind of helps you to be able to learn and pick up dance skills faster, but may also have some transferability to other movement patterns and skills. And there's
Yeah.
actually something I was reading the other day that's really interesting, which is there's oscillations in brain activity that match the rhythms that people are dancing to.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, so there seems to be something. So we know all movement, all exercise is good.
Yeah.
We know all physical activity is great. and we know other athletes have higher levels of neuroplasticity. But there's something to be said with sharing movement with others and sharing movement that's rhythmic, and particularly with others. And they've found that kind of when they look at this rhythmic movement, they see oscillations in brain activities that are similar to the oscillations we see in music, which is quite cool.
And are those oscillations a good thing to have those varying rhythms?
Yeah, so it's to do with like almost like the brain getting into that flow state.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, so quite
So that,
interesting stuff.
yeah, that 20-minute walk that we're being recommended to do should be 20 minutes dancing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said too. Like we were talking about cultural aspect of it.
Yeah.
Every culture in the world has dancing, and
Yes.
that's because dancing not only offers something physical, but it's creative expression, it's social connection, it's sharing stories and messages. So it's a form of communication as well as it's a form of physical activity.
Yeah.
And we can see that too in the language that we use when we describe dancing. So, we'll say like this dance has a movement vocabulary. So we talk about it as if it's a language. You have a connection which occurs, which again is a very linguistic kind of
Yes.
term.
I often think about dancing with a person as a conversation, as a dialogue, that they say
Yes.
something, I say something else, and it's that constant ebb and flow of energy between each other.
Yeah, and there's a role each person plays. One person's the lead, or the person talking, the other person's the follow, the other person listening. And these are quite common sort of ways to describe, particularly salsa. But even when you're talking about ballet, you have a performer who is communicating something to a listener, which is the audience.
Yes,
So
very much so.
there's still that communication that's happening. And communication is a really important factor in dancing. They were looking at dancing and autism and how it helps improve communication because there's expressions in the body and in the face, and it helps them to autistic people, it helps them to adjust their communication strategies to fit within kind of the social context
Well,
that they're
yeah, because
in.
we have such a
Um,
restrictive culture of I speak, you speak, I speak, you speak. That doesn't work for all brain types at all.
and it also doesn't work for all cultures. So
Yeah.
one of the nice things about so the research that I'm looking at is looking at embodied cognition theory, which is a theory where it's not just our brain involved in our cognitive process, but it's also our whole body. And sometimes
Okay.
there's a group of theories called the four E's that embodied cognition is part of, and the other ones are extended, embedded, and inactive. And they talk about cognition as actually being bigger than our bodies. It can be our environment, our culture, it can be the tools that we use. These are all parts of our cognition.
Yeah.
Um, and I think when you look at the way we think about mental illness now, we have a very kind of Western-centric view of what is healthy and what is unhealthy, and how do we confine people to that structure. And we think about the brain and the body being very separate.
Hmm.
Whereas when you look at other cultures, they think about the brain and the body in a different way. They think about mental health in terms of other things.
Okay. Can you give us an example of a culture that does this?
So when I was looking at some of the stuff to do with mindfulness coming from Buddhism, and I may not be 100% accurate on this, it's a very small part of what I'm looking at,
Sure.
but there's an idea in certain parts of Buddhist culture that mental illness comes from spiritual imbalances. So it's
Mm.
not something that's coming from the mind, it's coming from a bigger thing.
Yeah.
And you can see that when you look at cultures that are highly independent versus cultures that have like value independence versus cultures that value community. And
Yes.
the way that mental illness is different if you transpose someone from one culture into the other, and their risk of mental illness changes. So, so this idea with embodied cognition is that the body plays a role in cognitive processing. And if you look at the purpose that dancing has served in a lot of cultures, is that it is an embodied language. It's a way of communicating a message. So
Yeah.
a study I was reading earlier this week is called Why the Robots Can't Haka, which is the
Okay.
haka is a New Zealand Māori dance, and it's looking
Yes.
at um, sure, the robots can move the way that the Māori move when they perform the haka, but it's not communicating a message from one community of people to another
Mm.
community. It's not, there's no physiological response within the body of either the person performing or the people listening.
Yeah, the listeners will
So
get
the
no
purpose of the
emotional
dance,
reaction to that.
yeah, so the purpose of the dance is bigger than just the physical movement. The purpose of the dance is to, one, convey a message. It's to release emotion and express emotion. And it's to connect with stories from our past as a community or as a culture. And I think those are things that when you dance, you know that, you know, like you'll be dancing and a song will send a tingle up your spine. And that's not happening because of your brain. That's happening because your body is moving and it's involved in this process of connecting with the music. And I mean, even things like if you think in salsa, we have the clave, which is the heart
Hmm.
of the music, right? And you'll often hear people talk about how they feel it in their soul, you know. Well, what is our soul? Our soul is not something we can tangibly grab onto and measure, but we have this feeling of it being there. So I think it's a really interesting idea to consider that, you know, cognition and mental activity is not in the brain, is contained within the body and the way that we move and the way that we experience the world around us.
Wow. So do you think the soul then could be, it's that combination of everything? It's the physiological, the psychological, all coming together.
Oh, I don't know. I possibly, yeah. I mean, I haven't really thought too much about this soul. I kind of think maybe it's a way that people maybe describe that or describe something we can't tangibly. It's kind of like that life force, right? We don't
Yeah.
actually know what is a life force. We still don't have an answer for how life comes about and how it is created and what happens when the body's still there, but the life is gone. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, maybe it is the driving force of the cognition around us. I also think something I was thinking about the other day that's kind of quite interesting is that if you think about dance almost as the organism, dance has us as kind of cells contributing to its life, and it is able to transmit memories from the past through traditional dance styles or performances, whether that be some of the Afro steps coming into salsa from sort of the Afro-Caribbean slave trade times, where there was, you know, sort of the heaviness of the movement, and then there was also the dragging of the chains and all of these kind of movements that we use in salsa. And then telling that story and how that's changed and how society's changed and moved on. And that's the same with, well, not moved on is not the right word, but how society's kind of changed and dancing has changed in response to the movement forward in time. But we still have those memories coming through
Yeah, and if we take the
in
time to
dance.
look, we can actually see those memories are still very much alive in the dance and are they're
Mm.
not going to be forgotten.
No, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about dance is it's kind of like a living memory,
Yes.
right? It's something we're all part of.
Yeah, I
Um,
definitely feel that. I love the organism um idea because it does feel like you're part of something bigger. Sometimes it's
mm,
just in the community, sometimes it's during a song. There is that sense of wow sometimes.
yeah. And I think there's that sense of like connection to something
Yeah.
that has meaning. And I think a big thing for me is respecting and learning more about the culture that's involved in in salsa or whatever style it is that you're learning. Like a friend of mine, she's a very good pole dancer and she teaches pole. And they were talking about strippers being involved in pole dancing. And she was like, but that's where it comes from. You can't have pole dancing and not
Yeah.
recognize that strippers are, they created it. Like,
Yes.
so there has to be that appreciation and understanding that that's where it has come from. And yes, it might adapt and it might change and it might become something that's, you know, open to a wider range of people. Like salsa obviously has its origins in sort of Afro-Caribbean dance. I'm not Afro-Caribbean, but I dance salsa. So it's, I'm stepping into someone else's culture
Yeah.
when I dance. And I think there's, you have to be mindful of the fact that the connections I have with it, although I feel like they're really profound and they relate to me and certain things that I can think about with regards to my own heritage, they're someone else's heritage. And I have to make sure that, you know, I'm aware that that's I'm transmitting memories and stories that come from another culture.
Yes, that respect for the culture and acknowledgement that, as you say, we're stepping into something else. Because as well, for me, I'm not part of an
Mm,
Afro-Caribbean background, but it's something that I've started to become aware of in the last couple of years. That
mm,
there's so much depth I haven't thought about, which I think should be thought about. Like, how amazing would it be at congresses and festivals if we had more of not
mm.
just dance lessons and movement lessons, but
The
engaging with the
history.
culture of salsa? How much richer would our dance
Yeah.
experience be with that?
I mean, I think that's what allows you to really feel the movement and really understand
Mm.
and feel the music and the movement and what it is that you're dancing with. And I know there was a really interesting discussion about dancing salsa or dancing bachata and not speaking Spanish, and how well can you really connect with the music if you don't speak the language. And I think that's just one interesting sort of take on uh, you know, being aware that dancing, yes, it's a physical movement to music, but it is when you're dancing certain styles, you are well, you're engaging in a community and a culture that is been around for a long time, and it has a really interesting and diverse history. And I think the beautiful thing about salsa, and one of the things I love about it, is it's been really welcoming. Like, it's been a really welcoming environment for so many different groups of people that maybe it wouldn't have welcomed 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, because it wouldn't have been welcome in their communities.
Mhm.
And I think it's a nice way to demonstrate in lots of ways how the world has progressed and how we are able to now share these other cultures. But I think we can't lose sense of the fact that, it is the culture is so important to the style.
Yeah.
Salsa is not something you can dance without appreciating where it comes from, whether you're dancing Cali salsa or LA or Puerto Rican or wherever it is.
Mhm. It's got that depth to it.
Part of the reason I'm so interested in salsa is I'm looking, well, not salsa, but dancing, is I'm looking at the connection between mindfulness and dancing.
Okay.
Um, and I think if you're like me, my brain is kind of always doing something. And I've never been someone that can really like sit down and be mindful,
It's
like,
so difficult.
and I just don't
Yeah.
think it's for me. And I've learned to accept that. Like, I'm not an active relax. I'm an active relaxer. I find it really hard to like sit down and rest. And it's not because it's hard. It's because my brain gets bored and I start wanting to do other things. Whereas when
Mm.
I'm physically active, that's when I feel relaxed, because
Okay.
I can get my brain to calm down. And I think dancing is something that really leaned into that for me, is that I can actually be really, almost, I can be really mindful of myself when I'm dancing.
Yes.
And it's
Well,
probably one of the few spaces where that connection happens for me.
mm. But that's the
And
thing. I mean, I've been practicing mindfulness the last just couple of months, literally, and it is very difficult just sitting with nothing
mm,
and sitting with just no thoughts is really, really difficult to
mm.
relax and to let things go and to focus on different specific things. But further down the journey, they they do talk about it doesn't have to be sat still doing nothing. Mindfulness
Mm.
is how it works for you and where that clarity of space or being comes from. So
And it,
it makes perfect sense that it can come from salsa. It can come from whatever works for you.
and I think that's the thing when you look at, um, if you start to think about what you're doing when you're dancing, what are your thoughts when you're dancing? Often you're thinking about that kind of attention to your body, that awareness of what's happening physically within you, how you're feeling, what's happening with your breathing, what's happening
Mm.
with your partner. Like, you're very mindful when you're dancing because it draws your attention to that. And I think that's one of that's sort of where my research is heading, is I'm looking at this idea of mindfulness in the traditional sort of sense of drawing attention to your body and focusing on either breath work as a tool for that, or that sort of attention and awareness sort of factor of it. But then also, do people who do something like engage in dancing, are they doing that anyway? Are they doing that as a form? Are they using dance almost as a form of mental health regulation by engaging in embodied mindfulness? They're focusing on kind of movements and expressions and how their body's feeling and how it's expressing the emotions that they're feeling and that deep connection with themselves. And is that just a different way of thinking about mindfulness, as rather than being something that's static and stationary, but something that people actually already do as a skill, and they don't need to relearn it in a stationary, static position. They just might be more inclined to deal with it in a way that is active and embodied, rather than kind of separating the two.
And this brings us back again to not separating the two, physical and psychological. We've separated them in Western culture, but is that to our own detriment?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing when you look at how important dancing, like I said, has been to so many different cultures. And there's some quite interesting research on how dancing improves Indigenous health outcomes, and engaging in dancing improves immigrant outcomes as well in terms of health. And I do sort of wonder if that's because a lot of people around the world use dancing as a form of sort of that embodied kind of mindfulness. And if you say mindfulness must be done this way and you must sit and be stationary and silent, or you at least learn it that way, or that's the common thread of how we think about it, we're sort of discrediting all these other cultures that already engage in a form of mindfulness, but in a way that's movement based. And I think that's sort of, again, interesting when we think about how psychology deals with other cultures. It's not traditionally a very good discipline at dealing with other cultures or outside of Western sort of perspectives. It likes to kind of have its Western narrative. And I think if we look at the way other cultures experience mental health, dance is kind of a nice way to look at that, because dance does come from every different culture, and it's almost adaptable to everyone in the world if you enjoy movement.
There is a style of movement to suit everyone.
And I think the prerequisite for dancing is, do you enjoy moving in music? And if you do, then, you know, it's a potentially viable treatment for physical and psychological ailments.
So we've got the physical, mental, psychological, cultural, it all comes together.
Yeah. I think this is why I really love this theory of embodied cognition. It's a relatively new sort of theory in the psychology world. But it just looks at people as being more complex than just a mind and a body, you know, like we're a mind and a body, or we're a body and mind connected that lives inside a community, that lives inside a bigger community, that lives inside the world and the universe as humans. And I quite like that sort of idea that we are all shaped by the environment that we're in, and we also shape the environment that we're in.
We do, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really good quote by a pain psychology researcher called Lorimer Morsey. And he said, change is inevitable, but you choose the direction. And I think that's a really nice way to think about it. Like, we're always changing. The world is changing around us. We're getting older. We're doing different things. We're exploring different things that we love. Things are always changing, and things will always change. So long as you're alive, things are going to be changing in your body, in your environment, in your mind, whatever it is. But you kind of get to direct how that impacts you and what you do with the change, and to an extent, what is actually changing.
So let's choose our own directions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Lucy Woodham, thank you very much for coming on and chatting to us about the links we have with the physiological, the psychological, the cultural, bringing it all together into the holistic human.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Empowered Dancers podcast. If there's an aspect of the dancing you would like to hear about, or a particular teacher you would like to hear from, drop me a message and I will try to make it happen. Make sure you subscribe to get every episode as it comes out. Thank you so much for the comments and questions you are already sharing. I really, really appreciate it, and I look forward to serving you in next week's episode.